You're listening to The Soloists. My name is Diana Brown. I'm here with my friend and co host, Mallory Everton. And today we are joined by a very beloved guest, a sex therapist and new author, Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. So, welcome to The Soloists, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And do you want to just tease your book a little bit?
Sure. Well, like 4 years ago, Faith Matters reached out to me and asked if I wanted to write a short book on the relationship between sexuality and spirituality. And it turned out to be a longer book and to take about 4 years longer than originally envisioned. The reason I said yes to it, actually, because I've been approached a lot in the past, was because I really care about this question and I didn't really have the answer. And I knew it was like a theme that was in all of the teaching that I do and always felt like it was present, but I just hadn't really worked out in my own head what that relationship is. And especially in a faith culture where we often think of those as separate spheres entirely. I remember once my Relief Society asked me to come and teach on my dissertation topic, which was LDS women and sexuality. And someone was like, "You're going to have her speak about this in the church," which is to say, like, could you have anything more, anti-spiritual than that? So I think we have a lot of cultural ideas that the two work in contradiction. And I would actually say they're two sides of the same coin. They're deeply, deeply connected. And so the book is my argument for that. And it's written primarily with an LDS audience in mind and for married couples, because that's been the biggest focus of my work, is working with people who are in committed relationships and working through their differences and how to create a mutually meaningful, intimate relationship. Anyway, so I'm really talking about how intimacy is really fundamental to spirituality and how it also how it's a marriage or a committed relationship is a crucible of our development, and how sexuality can be a part of that. So, yeah.
So I have a question for you about just your experience with our community. I'm curious, what energizes you about your work with members of the church? What's interesting to you about it?
That's a great question. I grew up in New England, but in many ways, like, very much an outsider. And so my branch that was later a ward was so very much my family, and they were the people that loved me. Like my actual extended family was all in Utah and Idaho. And so we had like an adoptive grandmother, and I remember I got sick and somebody in the ward came over. My mom was out of town visiting her mother, and they came and got me and took care of me because my dad was at work. Just like I was given these very formative experiences of how much like there's a God that loves me, that what I do matters, like these very formative meanings that were so foundational to my sense of self and the spiritual core of my life. At the same time that as I got to be 12 and 13, just looking more at the relationship between men and women, seeing a lot of young women's leaders and so on, just feeling like they were depressed, even though they were talking to me about obedience and so on, and just feeling like there was this contradiction sometimes between these kind of core fundamental truths and then these sort of cultural realities that seem to suppress people's joyfulness. These questions, these tensions, like they mattered to me. And so I was always in this wrestle of the question of what's true and what's right and what's good and what makes us happier and what gives us a meaningful life. And going on a mission, I just kind of forged more of a clarity in my own heart and my sense of God, just like that grappling with these questions mattered and that I wanted to do it. And I've often had people approach me and say, I really should work in the non-LDS community. There's like a lot more customers there. And I don't know, somehow I'm just like, I don't want to. These are my people. These are the ones I care about. So I guess it's just this, like the clarity of there's so many deep, meaningful truths there. And yet there's often ways that we interpret it and make sense of it that really work against us. And maybe it's just been my desire to help people within my community, the people I love, to find a better way. Latter-day Saints are my favorite.
I I love that. I could talk about this all day. Your work has meant so much to me. You provided a model for me that it's not just problems to be solved, but
Mm.
questions that are worth really sitting with, and that can even be exciting. It can be
Mhm.
interesting, and it can be helpful to others. It's not
Yeah.
just like, is the church wrong or is the church right about
Yeah.
this? It's like, isn't this interesting? I'm just really, really grateful for the posture.
Oh, wow.
It's a
Yeah.
very helpful posture for me in my spirituality and just my development as a person.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Mallory. That means a lot to me. Yeah.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think the first time that I ever heard of you was it must have been, yeah, it was over a decade ago. Somebody sent me an article that was you in conversation with Christine Hagland
Oh, yeah.
on the question of obedience versus integrity.
Yeah.
And it really spoke to me on, like, I had so rarely encountered content like that, that it landed a position of critique of the church that was not from the outside saying it needs to change, but so squarely on the inside and saying
Mm.
it needs to live up to what this really is. And I really felt deep faith in what you were
Mhm.
saying, where I think the idea behind this was that out of an effort to ensure the safety of everyone, that the church will sometimes emphasize conformity and obedience to rules that sometimes can feel at the expense of moral development and helping people develop autonomy and a sense of integrity with their own values. That if there's a culture created where people are afraid of diverting or using their own hearts and minds to figure out a way that creates a culture where people don't develop into the full human beings they want that we're
Yeah.
supposed to. And throughout that, you can hear these deep gospel themes of spiritual progression, and that the
Yes.
whole reason that we're here is because we're supposed to be becoming something.
Yes.
These creatures who can bear more, who can
That's
love
right.
more. And anyway, that was like a very powerful article for me to read, and it's been a good anchor point. Um,
Wonderful.
and and to that point, I think this podcast, the elephant in the room for so many singles, especially older singles, is sex. Given that the law of chastity, which believing baptized covenanted members formally commit to doing, which like forbids sexual relations outside of marriage, that just gets really, really tricky for older singles. And there's all sorts of questions that emerge around that. And the obedience and integrity frame is so helpful, I think, for thinking through what's at stake with different aspects of that. So the chief question when we get into it with people that rarely anybody wants to state on a podcast publicly, but like
Let's
all
do
of
it,
all of
Diana.
our friends will secretly like, this is the question, is like, do you
Yeah.
mature out of the law of chastity? Or like, is this really the way to find love? And I think there's multiple dimensions to this that we can get into.
Mhm.
First is just the sense of like personal development, right? Like, can you be a
Mhm.
whole person without being in touch
Mhm.
with your sexual erotic self? The second one sometimes is just purely sociological, which I'm curious to hear
Mhm.
your thoughts on too, which is like, okay,
Yeah.
sometimes you're dating somebody who isn't committed to this
Yeah.
and who, who
Yeah.
wants you have to compromise as you try to do things and try to figure out who you want to love. And so that can be a
Yeah.
challenge too. So I'm really excited to jump into this conversation today and to mine your very wise heart and mind about some of these questions.
Mhm.
But yeah, can you mature out of the law of chastity? Or another way of putting it, like, can you mature within it into the types of beings that we
Mm.
want to be?
Mm.
I'm curious where you would begin breaking down like different components, like what do we need to understand in order to even start answering that question?
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad we're gonna start there because yeah,
Yeah, I'm not forcing a yes or no
We'll
here.
start with some
yes or no.
definition.
What's the answer?
Yeah.
Yes, yes,
I mean, okay, where do we
yes.
start? Let's see. One of the things that's sort of a backbone of my book is I take several serious theorists models of our development and I just create a 3-stage model of how we develop morally. And so like when we say obedience is the first law of heaven, I think it's true in the sense that is the first place that we need to start, because when we are very small, when we are young, when we are ignorant, when we don't know the world that we're in, it's virtuous to borrow wisdom because you're going to get hurt otherwise. And so just to have someone say this is good and this is bad, even though it's more complex than that, a child can't understand it, a young person can't understand it. And we do well to just say, okay, I don't even know why, but things are going to go better for me if I just stay on this side of the line. And that's true. And often what happens is that, when those are given out of love, it helps us keep ourselves safe and keep ourselves able to develop to the next stage 2, where you start to really inherit the mores of your culture, or in other words, the law of chastity, just different principles that we learn in the church. You really learn, like, how does my group understand what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, what my role is, how I can contribute. And it's not just about keeping ourselves from getting out of trouble like stage 1 is. It's more connected to, I don't want to hurt the people that I love. I want them to be well. So it matters how I behave, because not only could it go badly for me, it could go badly for somebody that I really care about. And so when we're about age 8, about the time that we get baptized, we become more capable of this social way of thinking. And one of our primary goal in the first stage is to be safe, to not get in trouble, right? But our primary goal in the second stage is to belong. Most humans do not grow out of this stage because belonging is so fundamental to how we're wired. We know that if we don't belong, we might die, right? We want to belong to our tribe and our group. And so in order to belong, it's valuable at first to just say, how does mom think about this? How does my church leader think about this? Because again, you need to borrow frames of reference. If we had to sort everything out on our own, we'd be in tough shape. That's why you go to authority. That's why you go to a doctor who knows about this disease, right? They can direct you imperfectly, perhaps, but still they know more than you do. It's very easy to not go to the next stage, which is to learn how to think for ourselves. So when we're in stage 2, we think like our group thinks. And we may think that we think it on our own. If your whole family is a Republican and everybody in your neighborhood is, then it's a very, very good chance you're going to be a Republican in stage 2, because you think like your group thinks. Or if you're a therapist, it's a very good chance you're going to wear big beads and linen clothing because everybody else at the conference is wearing that clothing. I'm just saying, like, it's not specific to church. You're kind of like, what kind of person is a therapist? Well, you just naturally do what your group does to establish that you're the right kind of therapist, or that you belong here. So very, very intuitive thing as human beings. We start mimicking our friend. We do it without thinking about it. But when our moral development continues, like, we take what we internalized in stages 1 and 2, and through that process, we've developed more of a compass. We've borrowed wisdom. But then we go from the letter of the law to being capable of the spirit of the law. And I don't mean rebellious or like I can do whatever I want because I'm so stage 3. Some people have talked to me like that. I'm like, no, that is not stage 3. That is like actually 1. That's just a rebellious one. But anyway, like, rebellion is not the same thing. Okay. Stage 3 is you really care about the rules. You're not like here to just thumb your nose at rules. Okay. They have, there's a purpose in them. You're not letting conformity or the fear of not belonging or the fear of sanction or the fear of anybody's invalidation of you allow you to betray what your soul really knows is right. Okay. Because in stage 3, you have developed enough of an internal compass that you can reference it. And this, again, happened through stages 1 and 2. So you need those stages. We need the institution of the church. We need institutions. Those are very much, they cultivate stage 2. They help people get out of the impulsivity and the self-service of stage 1 to learn how to cooperate, to learn how to be a member of a community, to learn rules like your sexuality is a gift, but you can be destructive with it. That's what you're learning in stage 2. And so stage 1 might be just don't touch yourself or don't touch anybody else. Okay. It's just like black and white. Stage 2, you're learning more like, okay, this is a good thing, but it matters how you are in relationship with other people. And so don't do this and don't do that, and make sure you're committed before you are fully sexual and so on. So you're learning these frameworks and they matter. In a marriage, a lot of people are just doing stage 2 roles, well, men have needs and you should be managing my needs. And they're thinking more in terms of identities and roles, not intimacy. Stage 3 is where intimacy begins in the truest sense, where you actually are like, what does it mean to love my spouse through my sexuality? What does that mean for who I am and who she is or who he is, right? Like, how does this actually apply itself? What does it mean in this marriage, in this relationship? So it's more where where we're more deeply using our agency to, as you said, Diana, taking on more moral weight, really discerning. And there's a kind of freedom in it, but there's a much deeper responsibility in it too. And you're not flippant about the morality of those questions at all, but you also understand they belong at your feet, not at anybody else's.
That last line might be the trickiest thing about this.
Mm-hmm.
So authority is a very important word in our tradition, right?
Yes.
I think the last line could be interpreted as, oh, I have authority in myself above anybody else, in my life. Where does that contradict this need for priesthood authority that outlines certain guidelines or expectations, and often in a sort of black and white way?
Well, first of all, I do think authority in the church is speaking to people that are in any of those 3 stages, right? So that is to say that depending on where you are, you may need a different message in terms of how to facilitate your development. But I actually think within our faith, we have both elements. Like, there is an element of here's the law, here's the structure, here's the idea, here's the expectation, here's the ideal. But then there is still this piece that I think many of us do not take seriously, which is that, no, I have to determine what this means for me. I have to, in my own relationship with God, in an honest conversation. This is not indulgent. I mean, a lot of people want to go there with it. This is not about, I get to do whatever I want because I'm so developed. It's not that. This is that I actually understand that I bear the moral weight of this decision in an imperfect world. I mean, that's the Adam and Eve story, in my opinion, is that you're making a decision within complexity. What I think a lot of us want and want to believe is if I obey and I do everything the right way, it's going to work out for me. Now, I do think it's true when you live truthful principles, as Joseph Smith said, like, you get the benefit of living by true principles. But I think a lot of us have the idea that God is so into obedience that he's just going to give you rewards for just obeying, even if it makes no sense. Even if you, in your heart of hearts, think it's wrong. Okay. And I just don't think that's right. I don't think, anyone here listening can take it or leave it. What I'm saying, you may not agree with me, but I think it's never should we let obedience or loyalty interfere with our conscience. Right? Our conscience is primary. And so, it's very valuable to have a church community to help scriptures, prophetic counsel, to help shape our conscience, to help us understand that what we do matters, that there is right and wrong, that there's a God that cares about us doing what is loving and fair and good. So that's highly valuable. But the discerning of what that is, I think ultimately we have to determine that. And I don't mean we have to determine it like it's a free, whatever we think goes, but more like I have to wrestle with that question. It's just like Eve did, to wrestle with that question and figure out where I'm going to stand in the complexity. Mm-hmm. And I mean, a lot of us don't want that world. We want a world where somebody tells us what to do, we do it, and everything works out. Because wouldn't it be better to have that kind of world? It's just easier. But that's not the world we're in. We're in a world that is a moral conversation, whether or not we want to be in it. And what we do shapes our souls, shapes other people's souls. And being awake to that project and knowing that God cares about how we orient to those questions is important. And sobering. I think it's a little bit hard to live in that awareness because you recognize how much control you don't have. And yet we are responsible. We live in the consequences of our choices.
What I love about what you're saying is that I think it lines up well with what you were saying about intimacy in partnerships, but it also obviously applies to intimacy with God. That you're in some ways your true intimate relationship with God can't really happen until you're being
Yes, that's right.
fully honest. I have probably said this on this podcast before, but a couple years ago, after my dad got out of heart surgery, he was really extra
Mm.
spiritual and emotional. And he, at one point, we were on a walk. We would go on these really slow and steady walks and just talk about God. And he brought up, Mallory, you have to be completely honest with God about everything,
Yeah.
or else he can't help you. And I really hadn't thought of it that way before, that it's like, well, if you don't show your
Yeah.
real self to God with your real actual questions or opinions, that, like you were saying
Yeah.
about your conscience, then you actually really can't be in
Right.
full collaborator mode with God. You can't actually really do
Yes.
anything. You can't
Yes.
experience the true intimacy of it. And I think what you're saying about people potentially in stage 2 who have gotten to a point, but the reason I'd like to bring this up is because I think a
Yes.
lot of singles feel this way, where they do feel like,
You're right.
I did everything
Exactly.
right. I think it's
Yeah.
a very classic example in the church, actually, because of how much emphasis we have on marriage and nuclear
Right.
family, that it's a heavy, heavy experience to get to that point where you're like,
Yeah.
I really, really thought that doing all of this would get
Yeah.
me a husband or a
Yeah.
wife or a child or whatever it is feeling completely out of my grasp at this point in my life. And I'd be curious about what you might say to someone who is in that exact position. Like, what do I do now? All I've done for so long is try
Yeah.
to
It's
do exactly what I thought God wanted. And now I feel like I maybe need to do what God doesn't want me to
yeah.
do because I don't know how to keep
Well,
doing
it's very hard. I mean, because the disillusionment, and I think this is a part of our moral development, is disillusionment. I mean, we don't want it to be the case. But like
it.
one of my favorite books is Falling Upward, Richard Rohr. And
Richard
basic
Rohr.
this
I love
idea
him.
that at some
Mhm.
point or another, we have a fall. We have this descent that feels like everything is going wrong and our world is falling apart. I think the work I do with people so often is when they are in that descent and they are like, I am out of my depth. I need help. I need a perspective to help me make sense of my life. But this is also when people grow the most, because I sometimes like compare it to like a kitchen remodel. Like you're getting through with your crappy kitchen, but it could be so much better. And when you come in and do the demo, it's so disorienting. You don't even know how to make a burrito anymore because the microwave's covered in dust and you can't. And so it's very, very, very stressful. But that's like when something new can grow that accommodates more reality. And I would say that our understanding of God and spirituality and love and who we are goes through those kinds of disorganizations if we're doing things right. Like you come and you run into a brick wall in life and you're like, I did not see that. I obviously have a blind spot about how life works, about who I am, about what things are. And so one of those can be like, I thought I was told that if I did all of the things, it would all come together. I would be blessed. I've got my medallion and I do not have a husband,
Mhm.
and that's very distressing because I think for some people, they felt like they actually gave up things that maybe they thought were important. They decided not to pursue a degree or something like that. And I've worked with people that got married early, kind of against maybe their own core ideal, but they did it out of obedience. And then their spouse cheated on them. And so the disillusionment is really, really painful. And I think it sounds like cold comfort or maybe even a little callous to say this, but I think it's not the way life works. It's not, it's what's falling apart is an old way of thinking. It's one that probably worked for you at a time that actually had value, but you're growing into clearer picture of how the world actually is, what it's like to be outside of the Garden of Eden. And you're up against the questions, the hard questions of who you're going to be when you don't have any good choice as far as you can tell.
Yeah.
Just like that, the Adam and Eve moment. There's nothing that's like obviously the right thing.
I appreciate the direction this has gone so much, because I think when it comes to this question of singles and sex and what's appropriate or what's not, and it's true that landing on the question of conscience, it's still murky, right? Like, and discerning your conscience is not always like super easy. But I do think that naming that there's a few things that often are in the room that really cloud it is so valuable. One of them being deep disillusionment or despair.
Yeah.
And that often choices we make around our sexuality are kind of born of that. Sometimes it's conscience telling us like, okay, I think I'm going to make this choice, even if it's like a step beyond what the church would recommend or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think often there's
I
deep
agree with
despair
that.
and disillusionment. Really, the goal is to like whatever you choose to do, to be in alignment with our conscience. That's what
100%
joy. And if we're making decisions out of despair, disillusionment, or like, okay, I just give up, that's probably not going to be satisfying in the long term.
So I have a couple thoughts about that. One is that sometimes, and I think that the more we can understand the larger project and teach, if we have children, teach our kids about the larger project of what we're getting towards, the more it helps. Like, because if you're learning the idea that obedience is the only thing that matters and you're going to just obey your way into heaven, you're not really helping people develop an internal reference point. So when they come up against disillusionment, I mean, sometimes I've been amazed at the people that were the most rigidly LDS have a disillusionment and then are just like, doing drugs on a Wednesday night when they have kids because they decided the church isn't true. It's like, yeah, okay, yeah, but like you still have children and you still have an impact on them, and to me, it's been kind of shocking, like in some ways, how they would just go from such rigidity into like almost complete anarchy. But it's because it was so externalized. So when that fell apart, there was nothing inside of them to then reference. Sometimes people have more of an internal reference point, but they have enough disillusionment, despair, grief that, as you say, Diana, then people can often, in that grief, make decisions that are more out of their anger, their despair. And that's all understandable. It's all understandable. But that might be different than really the question that often people need to get to next or ultimately, which is, who do I desire to be? What do I want my life to be about? What are the choices that I can stand behind and back up within me, right? Not because a lot of times when we rebel, we're actually relying on the authority to do the opposite thing. So we're still dependent upon the authority. It's like, oh, you say I shouldn't do this, I'm totally going to do that. When we're really, truly in stage 3, we're not trying to snub or push away, or it's not an act of anger. So, and not discrediting all those things and those feelings. Like, that's often how we find more solid ground, is going through those emotions and making choices that we then learn from and choose differently the next time. But I think that it's a process, and I think we owe ourselves compassion for that process.
Yeah.
It's like really what we're here for, and it's not easy.
Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a bunch of shame potholes in this space.
Yes.
And I think that can make it very difficult. I mean, even like what you're just saying about rebelling, basically what we're talking about is being able to have the full access to our agency, to be able to actually really be an agent in our lives, to use this beautiful day we were given the way we intend. And very hard to do in shame, or if we're reacting to an authority, like you said, instead of actually being able to connect with our deeper, like, root values, our true root values, not just the ones that are handed to you by the church, but the ones that are planted in your soul. I am curious if there's a way that we can breathe just a little bit more space or shine a little bit more light on some of these shame potholes. Is there a way to orient around your sexual development that is hopeful?
That's hopeful. I mean, I'm not sure if the hopeful is the word I would have chosen there. That I would say that is integrity driven. That is,
There we go. That's a better
that
word.
that is conscious and soulful. Maybe that's the word I would use. I
Mm,
think there is a way to do that, but I don't want to discredit that sometimes the way we figure out who we are is by making choices that don't align with who we are. And
right.
and then we learn from that and come to a place of deeper clarity within ourselves. And that's just part of the process. So I guess what I would say is that a lot of times people that are teaching from their own limited frame, like there's times when I would listen to people speak about sex and I'd think they're not having very good sex. Is very obvious. Like the way they talk about it, there is no chance that they're having good sex. So I think that, you can't help but teach from the frame you're living in. And so there's a lot of people that are pounding the pulpit about sex that are themselves deeply conflicted about it, maybe are actually engaging in behavior that's outside of their professed values. And so they are there to shame because they are also shaming themselves. So and I spend a chapter on that in the end of my book about how to talk to younger people about sex in a way that doesn't drive shame. That a lot of the imperfect messengers we're just speaking from our own experience and where we are in this process. I mean, as long as we have humans teaching, we're going to be promulgating limited ways of thinking. It's hard to get around. That said, I think the more that we can lean on the idea that we have this amazing theology, and so it's upsetting sometimes that we don't utilize it better. We really believe in the virtual value of embodiment, of having a body. And so while a lot of us confuse sensuality and pleasure with evil, like the body is an instrument of spiritual perception, and it's very much linked to our capacity for intimacy, for growth, for joy, which is the point of everything we're doing. The more we can talk to our kids and ourselves about the fact that our sexuality is just inborn, it's just who we are, we're sensual sexual creatures, the more we can get to the question of how do we relate to this part of being human in a way that produces goodness for our souls and goodness in our relationships. How do we handle this because I think sexuality is very, very connected to our souls. That's why sexual abuse is so devastating, is because somebody can come in and steal your iPhone. It's just not going to be anything close to what it is for someone to violate you sexually in some way, because it's so connected to the core of who we are. And so to talk about sexuality as something to safeguard because it's so connected to your soul, because it's very, very valuable way of letting someone in on the core of who you are, that you want to be careful with it because your soul deserves that. And that's true for men and women. It's especially true for women. I think that a lot of times we talk about it more as if it's a dangerous part of ourselves. That's why we have to be careful with it, rather than it's a highly valuable part of ourselves that is worthy of our care. I think we also need to stop confusing pleasure with indulgence, because pleasure is so much a part of joy. It's whether or not our pleasures open up our souls or do they shut them down? Are they a way of getting away from life, or are they a way of expanding our lives? Do they make us feel truer to ourselves and to our core, or are they a betrayal of ourselves and our core? And so we need to have richer conversations about pleasure.
Mm.
Because a lot of us think the good life is the denial, you live in this enduring till the end framework, and that's when God is happiest. And I think you can't actually have joy if you live that way. And so how do we relate to pleasure in a way that really increases our joy and our hope and our love of our lives.
When you start to get into a conversation around, okay, we're talking about pleasure versus indulgence. And what if we're talking about a Mormon man who has been single for 10 years and may not know whether or not he's going to end up in a situation where
Mhm.
he knows how
Mhm.
to access sexual pleasure outside of masturbation,
Mhm.
pornography. I mean, that whole conversation feels so fraught. I would love to know if you have thoughts or even just principles that could be helpful as people are trying to make a decision.
I mean, so the thing I would start with first, and I think is very, very important, is life is very different when you know you are the chooser, as opposed to somebody setting the rules and you're trying to either comply with them or defy them, because there's a kind of anxiety in it that complicates it. Because if you really believe like I should never ever touch myself, but sometimes I do, just that framing is going to create a lot of turmoil internally, because it's not conscious, deliberate, decided. It's more like I'm doing things and I shouldn't be. And so that is going to create a dissonance that will interfere with peace. And I don't mean to overemphasize that. A lot of times what I'm doing when I'm working with people, I've worked with people that have like compulsively looked at porn, and then they go, then their spouse says, in this one case in my head, you have to live in the basement for 6 months and you can't look at porn for 6 months. And then if you don't, then you can move back upstairs. But if you, anyway, so he goes literally 5 months and 30 days. And then on the last day, he looks at porn. Now I'm like, okay, that is not a coincidence. Let's like think through that. Like what's that about? And he was like, I don't know what that's about. It was just a bad month. And maybe it was, but what I think it's about, what he started to grapple with was how much he was living in this kind of compliance defiance. Like he's complying because he wants his wife to be okay with him and he wants his program members to think he's a good guy. But then there's a part of him at the very end that's like, stop telling me what to do. I want to live my life. And so I don't know that I want to move back upstairs. I don't want to have you be the boss of my life. So then he rebels against that. But in neither of those positions is he actually really claiming his life. And he was a person in particular that was coming out of some pretty compulsive behavior, right? He was doing a lot of stuff at work and things like that. And so my work with him was really about helping him sort out, what did he value? Who did he want to be? What did he think about his being? What did he think about it? Was he at peace with his behavior? Why and why not? And as he started to get more self around these questions, like then he was authoring his life. The compulsivity went way, way, way down. The level of intimacy, both with himself, because he started to know himself more, and then with his wife, went way up. At first she was like, who's this person you're talking to? Like she was afraid of it. But then she started realizing like he's actually getting more trustworthy because he's not either hiding or indulging or complying. But then I wonder when the other shoe is going to drop. He's starting to become more of a self in this conversation. And so that's the way development tends to go. And so if I'm talking to somebody who's single in their 30s, who's an active Latter-day Saint and wants to obey the law of chastity, then I'm like, okay, then I think you need to, like the women in my dissertation that were the most able to live by the law of chastity premaritally were the most clear that it was what they wanted for themselves.
Totally.
Yeah. The ones who had sort of externalized it were much more vulnerable to being coerced by a boyfriend, or they also had even if they did get through the dating period, but got married, sexuality still wasn't theirs. They actually felt like they lost something when they had sex, So the women who owned it both were true to their souls premaritally, even though not sexual, and then true to their souls in marriage while being sexual. And they transitioned rather easily because they were in both cases being true to themselves. So if you're coming in your 30s and I would want to understand, okay, where are your conflicts around it? What are the things that you're not clear about? And then just thinking through it. Like a lot of times it's the things we don't want to admit to ourselves that have the most power over us. And so it's getting more honest. Like I have a lot of people who say to me, I don't even want to be looking at it, but I can't help it. I have an addiction and I can't change it. And it's like, no, you got to start looking at the part of you that does want to look at it and understand that part of you and make sense of it so that you can get more conscious control over the question of what do you desire and what do you want your life legacy to be and how do you want to handle being, in this case, an adult who's unmarried, who is wanting to live in the church in a particular way. How are you going to handle those dilemmas? That's really what it comes down to. I wish I could give people the answer or the stamp of approval, but life does not work like that.
Yeah.
Because they live in those choices.
It's funny as you're saying this, I'm thinking about the most recent season of Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. There's this one part where I think it's Taylor's parents are confronting her on why she's still sleeping with her ex Dakota, even though they've supposedly all determined that he's not good for her. They need to separate. And so they're kind of like, okay, so why are you still doing that? She can't give a reason for why she keeps doing this. And so she describes he just comes over and then I don't know, it just happens.
There we are.
And there's a part of me that I was like, that's so real. And I guess just to be like, this is an area of life that is dealing with the body and these like instinctual impulses that are so much that there are often like disconnected from the part of us that is reasoning about the legacy that we want to leave or
definitely
or some of those higher order questions. And I think particularly when there's a real disillusionment with the story that the church gives you for your life, it can just be really easy to just like almost use that as like a relief or release valve. Like, hey, well, at least this is nice. Everything else, like you,
100%.
And so I'm curious how you would speak to that.
Yeah. And I think you really highlight something important there, which is like, we're embodied creatures and the body can seem to have a mind of its own sometimes, especially around sexuality. And it can definitely feel like you're along for the ride. At our peril, we teach often the idea that sexuality is more powerful than we are. I don't think that's the right idea. I think we're learning to be embodied, but part of it is to understand the body, to not be so disparaging of it, to understand that there is a wisdom in the body. Now, I don't mean to say that because your body wants to have sex, that means it's wise and it's leading you necessarily to truer places. But sometimes when we're just so afraid of the unintegrated parts of ourselves, or we're afraid of the body, we're afraid of our sexuality. What I think is striking to me sometimes in working with people is how much they're not trying to understand themselves or even understand the impulse to have sex with their soon to be ex-husband, or I don't know the story well enough here, but like why? Like there's a reason. It's not just the body. There's something there to understand. And the more I can understand it, the more conscious of an actor I can be. I can figure out if I can back that up and I am at peace with it or I'm not.
Yeah.
Right. And so look, life is imperfect. And a lot of times we're learning things, we're catching up to ourselves. We're like, why did I do that? Like, why did I think that? Why did I say that? But still, if we're really trying to understand what is true and what is real, that's how we come to make the choices that we can really back up. That's really what integrity is how do I align my choices with what I really believe is right? And when they're out of alignment, what can I learn from that misalignment? Is it that my behavior is showing me something I need to understand and then change my beliefs? Or the other way, is there something there that I'm doing that's working against me or others, and I need to change the behavior, but that I'm actually trying to find a synchronous and integration of those two?
Yeah. It's interesting. A few minutes ago, you used the example of the women who feel most comfortable with this choice are the ones who like made a very conscious decision about it, and the ones who externalized it
struggled more.
those were the ones that struggled more.
Yeah.
And yet, just speaking candidly, the church doesn't allow a legible identity that's in between those two.
Yeah, that's right.
It doesn't allow a legible identity where you can say, I am choosing to do this in the full eyes of God, and I feel okay about it.
Right.
And that's tough, because that then fuels this disillusionment problem, where it's like a loop, right? If you feel like you want to make a certain decision regarding your sexuality, but the whole story of the church comes into question. And anyway, this is something that I think is really difficult for a lot of people. There's a kind of life arc for, older singles where, and certainly not everybody follows this, but like a lot of people get to a point where they're kind of like, I think to move forward in relationships, or just like to feel human, I want to be more sexually open. And then it's like instantly their belonging in the church feels like the first thing that it just doesn't sit right anymore. And those things are so tightly linked.
Yes. That's
in a way where, if working with married couples, it's always a question of like quality of connection and faithfulness, and like some of the tricky things like there, but there's such a reward of like intimacy that's
right,
that
it's a different,
it's a totally different setup for the problem with singles.
Right, you're not in this kind of fundamental question of what am I going to be loyal to. And I think I do agree with that. Like, I worked with someone who got a divorce, his wife ended it, and he was left with several children. I'm just trying to keep an anonymity here, but he was left with several children who were pretty distressed by the ending of their parents' marriage. He fell in love with somebody, but he knew it was not right to, he came to this decision. He was a faithful member, loved church, but just came to the decision, it's not the right thing to get married and to put my kids through that. I can't do it. And yet, for him, he's like, I'm a full adult and I'm in a relationship with a woman that I love. And they did ultimately get married when the kids were gone. He just made that in full conscience, like, this feels like the higher way to do this. He wanted very much to stay participating in the church, but it just got to be too challenging, because I think there was a sense of there being a secret. And I think it can be hard to feel like you're participating, but you can't be fully transparent about who you are. And, or as you say, Diana, like, there's not this like legitimate identity of somebody who's doing it in a more, I'm not saying I feel this way, but that a lot of people feel there's nothing worse than what's the way they say that, the buffet Mormon, or the one that like goes and just
a la carte.
Yeah, a la carte. Yes,
a la carte Mormonism.
Yes, exactly. Like, you're either fully in or you don't belong. And I think that's unfortunate. I think a lot of times cohesiveness is built around a demanding ideology, right? But it doesn't help as much when those that are looking for more nuance or looking for a way to be true to themselves and belong, that can get trickier, and I still think it's worth that effort because I think we're a better community when we find the room to let people sort out who they are, but it is not easy.
Yeah. I'm grateful to you for bringing that up, Diana, because I think I'm starting to look at it as like the way we talk about the body of Christ. I just don't think single people are going away in the church, and gay people are not going away in the church. Trans people, like spaces that are currently like, you can't go to the temple if you're fully honest in your interview, if you're behaving in a certain way, or I'd like to believe that our arms can get flexible enough that it won't feel like a secret, and that will feel like it's okay for you to continue attending. I'm not sure how that looks to people, but I just don't think it's possible to not be an a la carte Mormon. And
well, everybody
really
is. No, everyone. Ultimately,
it's nice to have your choices and your decisions and your lifestyle validated by everybody around you. But I think that that's one of the reasons why the body of Christ is such a helpful metaphor.
It's one thing if you're in the church and you're trying to take it down, and you're trying to be
Right.
destructive. Okay, that's a different idea. But if you're in the church and we're all pointing to the same thing, we want to live Christ-like lives. We're trying to sort out what that means for who we are. We're bringing our honest selves to that, right? I think the more we can make room for that. I was talking to the bishop of my ward in Chicago. We haven't been in our Chicago ward in a long time, but we were there this summer just for 1 week. And he was saying, since COVID, that ward has lost a lot of people, and some of it's through moving, but some it's about people not coming back. And he was just saying to me, he's like, my only message to people is that you belong and we need you here. And it's okay if you don't believe like you think everyone believes, because nobody really believes like everybody thinks. Like everybody's in their own place, and you're just a part of us and we need you here. And so he said, that's just like been my message to everyone, and which is a wonderful message. So, I think that's what it is to be Christ-like. So I hope we do keep growing in that direction. I agree with that.
Yeah, it feels a little inevitable that, to me, and I'm not saying that I have any authority to actually say what's right or wrong, but it feels like our sociological reality, it just seems like we're doing a lot of disservice by making that line around the law of chastity and a feeling of belonging in the church so tight. Those are so tightly linked that if the one topples a little bit, it's just the other one goes so quickly. And I do wonder, in light of that, I had an experience recently. I was going on a few dates with a guy who was divorced, and it was actually so nice because there's just so many really beautiful truths about intimacy and the erotic that the church teaches, including just the intensity of love that you can really believe in. And I think what I was feeling as I was talking to this divorced guy who was married for like 14 years or something like that, and he was like, and you know what? The first 10 were wonderful. And to talk to somebody who like believes in what real intimacy can be like, it was like a distant light going on for me of like, oh, I actually haven't seen or felt like that kind of hope or like that kind of compass in the room for a long time on dates. Sometimes it just feels like you're, I don't know, in outer space with people trying so hard to believe that there's a planet where you could like find and build a home with someone. It's hard to explain, but there's just so many different,
That's so interesting.
even if you're technically going on dates and people will say things like, oh, of course I'm looking to settle down. To know what that actually looks like inside your heart is a different question. I'm just wondering, for single people who are not going to be experiencing deep intimacy in a marriage, but are trying to figure out how to be full and loving human beings outside of marriage and being in touch with your erotic sexual self, whether that means that you're sexually active or not, what anchor points would you give to guide like how we choose to do that?
Okay. First of all, it's really interesting what you're saying about this kind of loss. I mean, I think it's just worth saying, because I think sometimes when we have the ideal and then when the ideal doesn't work out, we're upset with the ideal, but there is something anchoring about the ideal, even if we are figuring out who we are in divergence from it, but it's still an anchor. And so something about what you're saying, Diana, is interesting to me, which is like our current culture is like throwing away a lot of like ideals and institutional standards. And so there's a kind of loss of kind of where are the guardrail, or what is the thing we're ultimately trying to get towards.
Yeah.
And that's just its own real loss too. Because I just to reiterate this, like I think the thing that's really good about institutions or stage 2 is, even though those are going to always be imperfect, well, or for most of us, we don't fully fit into whatever that is, that they still help our development and they give us something to kind of define within, even if we're going to do it in our own way. And so I think sometimes we can be upset when the ideals didn't work out in the way we thought, but there's still value in having them, even if we're then sorting out who we are relative to them. Do you want to actually reinforce what you're saying around how good and beautiful it can be to be able to love someone and to really share your full self with them, and how I think that is an ideal that the church teaches. It doesn't mean that everybody can find it or have it, but I remember a Catholic took my online course about marriage and sexuality, and he reached out to me and said, like, that is the first time I've ever heard anybody articulate an understanding of sexuality like that. He says, I've always only thought of it as sort of like, and I'm not saying Catholicism teaches what he's going to say, but this is how he had understood it, which is like, it's sort of transactional. Like we do things for each other, but it's not about this kind of soul to soul connection. It's not about sort of this kind of coming to really know and be known. And so he was like praising of that theological understanding. So I think that's there and it's real. I mean, but then of course we still live in the real world, and many, many people are married and desperately lonely, and people are single and might be well prepared to be in an intimate marriage, but can't find the right person. And so one thing I would say, let me see if I can articulate this, is that being in a peaceful relationship with our sexuality is not necessarily having sex. It's also not necessarily not having it. Okay. It's a different question. I think sometimes in our current environment, we treat it like you're healthy if you're having sex and you're not healthy if you aren't. And I just think that's not the right framing, because it depends on the why and what the meaning of it is. Like one of the things I teach all the time is the meaning of sexuality is the most important thing for whether or not it's erotic, is what is actually happening in this sexual interaction. What is it about? Is it an act of despair, futility, anger? Is it an act of love and openness and peace with oneself, right? And ease in the connection with the other? Then it's like deeply good for our souls. And so what I think is good for all of us is to understand that sexuality isn't inherently good, but sexuality and our relationship to pleasure can be a good thing in our lives. We just have to sort out in our situation and who we are, how is it to be, what is the way I could be in relationship to my body, my capacity for pleasure, the sensual world, in a way that fills me up, that makes my life richer. What is that for me? If I'm living in fear of the body, if I'm in a kind of division from it, what do I need to make peace with? How do I need to accept myself more deeply? What is it that I've got to reconcile in this gift of my body? Because I think if we're not at peace in our own skin, then there's a spiritual division within us. And so I don't know what that means in terms of your decisions and how you're in relationship to others, but there's something to get worked out in relationship to yourself. And I think that working that out is important, whether you're married or not married, in a relationship or not in a relationship, because this is a fundamental thing to even be capable of an intimate relationship, is you have to get to a deeper peace within yourself. And where am I rejecting of my body? Where am I not at peace? Do you think our spiritual progression has a lot to do with a deepening acceptance of the human condition, of our embodied imperfect nature, and just being able to have compassion towards all of it, the uncertainty of it all, the vulnerability of it all, the imperfect way in which we've tried to live good, loving, meaningful lives, but deeply imperfectly. And so that's where the peace is, I think, is often just being able to have compassion for the process that we're in.
Yeah. We've been talking a little bit about how the church doesn't allow a sort of legible identity where you decide to sexually explore beyond the bounds of the law of chastity, and that can lead to a sense of a lack of peace within the church and your belonging in the church. There's also this question, and this keeps coming back to me when I think about, like, okay, is this where I want to build my home spiritually? Is this where I want to stay? Which is, not thinking about my belonging in the church, but thinking about my belonging in this world and how I'm going to make peace with that.
Yeah.
Make peace with the constraints of time and belonging to an aging body and belonging to this time where we have, I don't know, like less structure around dating and courtship. And a lot of us fall through the cracks,
Yeah.
and maybe more and more of us will, or just can't kind of get on the track of the ideal that we like. I have to make peace about belonging to this world. And it's not like leaving the church is going to make all of these things go away. But I am so thankful for the church for teaching me the sort of spiritual alchemy of changing my heart and coming to be at peace with some of the bitter injustices of mortality. And like, which is not to say that I am all the time at all. That is like a light that I have in my room that I don't think I would have if I weren't, raised the way that I was, of this idea of like deep forgiveness for what life doesn't give us. And an ability to be at peace with in my own skin in that sense too, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I agree. One of the things I teach is like the quality of your relationships is like directly proportional to your tolerance for not getting what you want, which is like not necessarily the thesis that people are coming in wanting. It's like, give me the steps to get the marriage I want or get the life I want.
Yeah.
And of course, there's things we can do that make our lives better. So much of the growth happens around the adversity, around things like not going as we want. And I think at least when I was a kid, I used to think adversity was like, well, that's like the adversary. That's like when things go the wrong way. But rather than life's just deeply unfair.
Yeah.
Life's just deeply imperfect. Some people are born into bodies that are gifted and into situations that give them a huge leg up, and others are born into bodies that are more limited in situations that are more limited, and they struggle much more. And yet they are both spirits that have the same value. And so we have to tolerate that. And still we're in this moral process nonetheless of how do we have love and compassion in that imperfect reality, both for one another and for ourselves. I think that is the central project.
In terms of what you're talking about with being able to show more love and compassion, I would say not just to each other and obviously to ourselves, but also the circumstances of our lives. To be able to see those things as possibly graceful and loving from God has been massively helpful to me. More of an honoring of the life that you've had, the complications of being a person who is single or divorced or widowed in a space like this, and it's offered a lot more latitude in what I feel like I can do as an agent, but also just really calmed like those hot waters of just fear and doubt, made it possible to be a little bit more tuned into the gratitude and compassion for it, that it's okay. Like the circumstances of your life are the ingredients that you're working with, and that's okay. In fact, it's good. And there's a lot you can do with them.
That's even a real measure, if that's the right word, of moving in more deeply into a self-authoring position, is like you're kind of making you're like, yes, score. I knew I was hard. I always have known it. But it means kind of moving into a little more of that, like your 2 feet underneath you self-authoring position, less distressed by the limitations in it. That doesn't mean that there isn't still moments of pain and so on, but it's just more like, okay, here's where I've been planted, and there's a lot of value in that and pain. And what do I want to do with that? That's very much a stage 3 mind.
I feel like my real struggle right now is numbness about like some of these things. Like there is something about I don't feel like I have the anger or the frustration to anger goes nowhere towards life or towards the church. I feel like I'm reconciled with that. Disappointment also leads nowhere. Like at some point you just have to accept your life has given you. But the sense of numbness, that has been a little bit of the consequence for me at this point, about fears of,
Yeah.
life without a family, is I don't feel like I belong to any story or any plot that like really holds me.
Yeah, that's right.
Or compels my desires on a deep level. And maybe there's a much deeper level of forgiveness I need to get to, wherever I am inside, regardless. But I don't know how to fully describe it, but just this sense like I'm almost dissociated from my own life sometimes because nothing has made sense. Okay, that's an exaggeration. My life is great and lots of things have been great. And I have like lots of privileges. That's so I don't want to be too dramatic here. But like, I mean, I feel this way on multiple senses. I feel like I prepared career-wise to work in a world that doesn't make like the way that our country has gone. It's like things that I prepared to do are just straight up no longer possible. Preparing for family and thinking about that, like, I've tried so many things. I know there's always more I could work on, but I kind of don't know what to do.
I'm grateful you're saying it because I think it's probably many people's experience. It sounds like a loss of hope. Like people can do a lot of hard things if they have a sense of direction, something that I'm moving towards, a reason to be hopeful that this will work and make my life better. But if I don't even know if better is possible or what better even is, at this point, it can be much harder to find your grounding, find your footing. And that's really hard. It's much easier to do hard things that have a purpose in them. But to not know what that story is, as you say, that's hard. A lot of times we're borrowing kind of archetypes from our culture around, oh, this is the path I'm in. This is the story I'm in. This is the way it goes for me. And we haven't had many good stories for our single members.
Yeah.
We don't offer the same sort of dignity and legitimacy and pathways that have been walked before in a way that the community values. So that's very hard. And I wish I could say, okay, here's the answer, or here's the story. But I think it's also probably hard in a world that's also losing its footing. And, we don't have as many indicators of hope and morality and community in which to carve our path. So I think it's understandable what you're saying, Diana, and I think probably too many people's experience at this point.
Just thinking, I don't know what else to do in these moments, Diana, than try and think about, actually, I often think about, I think it was a Bednar quote that you shared with me about how when we feel the most tempted to collapse in on ourselves, that like the character of Christ is to turn outward. I mean, one of the hardest things about this whole conversation and what you just said, Jennifer, is that this is a very common experience. And that, not to cheapen it, we talk sometimes about the feeling of waking up in the same bed, wondering if your life will ever change. And I think many people are experiencing this. And I think singleness and loneliness and isolation are very important for us to grapple with together and try and figure out what to do. Because even if the two of us both manage to scrap together a partner eventually, this problem is going to keep growing. And I'm grateful that we've had these times to develop these tools together. And I hope we can all keep talking about it.
Yeah, I agree. And that's what keeps me going with this too, is just like, it's not just me. I do see the universal in this experience. For some reason, this really does feel like maybe the ultimate erotic question is like, how do you just kind of like life being what it is?
Yeah.
And
how do you keep staying hopeful? Because I think, I defined erotic for those who wouldn't know what that is, but erotic, the way I think of it, is like this human yearning to transcend ourselves, to reach into what's possible, to reach into the unknown. And it's very much linked to communion with the world, with another soul, with divinity. And it's the willingness to step into the unknown. But it's like very linked to hope, that if I reach out, that even in all the uncertainty, I'm reaching towards something that will make me more whole. I'm reaching towards something that will make the world better. And I mean, that's why faith is a virtue, is that you're literally willing to hope that you can do something that will affect reality, even when there's so much to despair around, that I can still make a difference for the person, you know, that at the checkout stand, that I can make a difference for the person I interact with as I walk to my car, you know, that to stay in the mind that in all the disappointment, I'm still an agent. I still affect the world, and my willingness to step into life when there's so much pressuring me into Thanatos, which is in the Greek mythology, the opposite energy of Eros, to pull into myself, to feel despair, that I'm going to still resist that and still choose to act, you know, like the Bednar quote, to turn in that outward way and say, how can I actually help another person, is actually to also lift my own soul. How do I make a difference in the world? Keeping track of the ways that you already are making a difference in the world. But I think that's the antidote to despair, is like that I actually have some effect on my own life and the lives of others.
Yeah, that communion is possible. That was so helpful in you defining that. And just to bring it full circle, and you're the expert on this, but like of sexuality and spirituality and erotic energy and its relation to spiritual wholeness. I really felt that in what you were just saying about, ultimately it's about communion with something that's not you.
That's
And
right.
I mean, whatever is causing this sort of dissociation, I think there's just too many things that are blocking that sense of communion. And communion will be, I think that'll be like an anchoring word for me going forward. That's like really helpful to describe what I want.
That's great. And it's like communing with another soul, with what we don't yet know, with a higher part of ourselves. It always leads us into uncertainty at first, but it always brings us somewhere better, somewhere more whole. And I think it's really easy when we're witnessing more of the lesser part of the human psyche in the world, in our discourses, to want to shrink from the world, like to feel more isolated, more despair. But maybe when we need most to use our agency and engage our hope, not only for its impact on others, but for just its impact on us, even if it's in the smallest moment, in the smallest thing we do, that we're not caving into the fear.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your vulnerability, Diana. I appreciate you bringing that up. And Jennifer, thank you for your time and your wisdom and your entire body of work, and for dedicating so much love and just powerful intellect to our cultural lexicon. We need you. And I'm very grateful to be alive at the same time as you. Really grateful.
You're very kind, really.
Thank you for listening, everyone. If you would like to continue the conversation with us, we invite you to subscribe to our Substack. You can find us at thesoloists.substack.com. That will allow you to get an email in your inbox every time we release a new episode, and you can click just directly on the links to the readings and the things that we're watching, reading, and thinking about. It also allows for easy two-way conversation with us. Hearing from you all is honestly the best part. No matter how cliche it is, I know every podcast says that, but it's really true. So please subscribe, and we'll talk to you soon.